My paper today will deal with the Kartvelian languages, the South Caucasian language group, and their lexicography. I will talk a bit about the historical development of Georgian lexicography with respect to nominal and verbal lemmatization, starting from the very beginning of Georgian lexicography until the present day. I will compare different approaches, and as an outlook, I will have, together with you, a look into the modern digital age. The Kartvelian languages, the South Caucasian languages, comprise Georgian, Swan, in northwest Georgia, Megrelian, West Georgia, Laz in Turkey, and southwest Georgia, and they are one of the three linguistic groups of the Caucasus. Here you see a map of the Caucasus, which shows you the great variety of languages on this not very large spot of our world, but we have just listened to the fact that it's the oldest one you can find. Among the Kartvelian languages, Georgian is peculiar in that it looks back on more than 1,500 years of uninterrupted literacy, thus exceeding languages like Russian or German by far. Roughly speaking, the history of written Georgian can be divided into three periods: Old Georgian extending from the 5th to the 12th century, Middle Georgian from the 12th to the 18th century, and Modern Georgian since the 19th century. The periodization notwithstanding, the structure of the language has remained quite stable throughout time, so that Old Georgian texts can still be understood by and large by modern speakers. In contrast to this, none of the Kartvelian sister languages has a written record of Old, and they are incomprehensible for speakers of Georgian. Astonishingly enough, there were no attempts to record Georgian lexicographically before the 17th century, if we let aside attempts to deal with some unknown or foreign words. At least no traces of earlier lexicographical work have survived. The first dictionary of Georgian was the Dizionario Giordano ed Italiano, published in 1629 for the use of missionaries in the Vatican by Stefano Paolini, who was supported by a Georgian nobleman named Nikipore Irubakidze. The first extant dictionary compiled within Georgia was the monolingual Lexicon Calculi by Sulhan Saba Orbeliani, who worked on it between the years 1685 and 1716, but it was printed only late in 1884. Before that, several other dictionaries of Georgian had been published abroad. First, the small Russian-Georgian lexicon in Goderzi Kiralov's Georgian Teach Yourself book at St. Petersburg, 1820, and second, Julius Klaproth's Georgian-French vocabulaire, contained in his Grammar of Georgian, 1827, which was printed in Paris. In 1840, David Chubinashvili published with the support of Marie-Félicité Brosset the first Georgian-Russian-French dictionary in St. Petersburg, and a Russian-Georgian and a Georgian-Russian dictionary by the same author followed between 1846 and 1891. Two dictionaries had been compiled before by David Chubinashvili's uncle Nicolos in the first half of the 19th century, one Georgian-Russian and one Russian-Georgian. They were first printed more than 100 years later in 1961 and 1971 to 73. From the steadily increasing production of Georgian dictionaries in the 20th century, we may first mention Richard Meckelein's Georgian-German and German-Georgian Wörterbücher of 1928 and 1937. The most remarkable autochthonous project of lexicography was the Explanatory Dictionary of the Georgian Language, initiated and redacted by Arno Chikobava, with 8 volumes appearing between 1950 and 1964, plus a compressed 1-volume edition in 1986, and a new edition is at present underway. Another remarkable achievement was the 3-volume Georgian-German Wörterbuch by Peter Schrenkeli, published in Zurich between 1965 and 1974, with its German-Georgian counterpart compiled by Jolanta Marchev, following in 1999. And in 2006, a big comprehensive Georgian-English dictionary in 2 volumes appeared in London, with Donald Rayfield being its editor-in-chief, and many colleagues from Georgia, among them our present host, contributing to it. Lexicographical work on the other Kartvelian languages began with word lists provided by travelers to or explorers of the Caucasus in the 17th and 18th centuries. The first word list of Megrelian was noted down by the Ottoman author Evliya Çelebi in the second volume of his travel book of about 1640. The list, written in Arabic letters fully equipped with vocalization marks, contains about 40 words, beginning with cardinal numbers from 1 to 11, plus 12 idiomatic phrases of Megrelian. The second world-list of Megrelian was compiled by Johann Anton Güldenstedt, a scientist who explored the Caucasus in service of the Russian Queen Catherine the Great between 1768 and 1775. His Vocabularium, published posthumously in 1791 as a Wörtersammlung, was used by subsequent authors like Peter Simon Pallas, George Ellis, and Julius Klaproth. The first comprehensive dictionary of Megrelian was the Megrelian Russian Slovak, compiled by Josef Lipschitze and published in his grammar of 1914, followed by the Megrelian Georgian Lexicon by Petre Charaya, finished before 1918 but printed only in 1979, in the same year as Gili Eliada's Materials. The most outstanding dictionary of Megrelian so far is that by Otar Kajaya, which appeared in 4 volumes between 2001 and 2014. Another comprehensive Megrelian Georgian dictionary is that by Alio Kobalia. For Swan, lexicography begins with Güldenstedt's word list again. As the first dictionaries proper, we may mention the Russian Swan Slovak by Ivana Nižaradze, which appeared as volume 41 of the journal Zbornik Materialov для описания местности Monte Caucaza in 1910. Some years before, by 1888, the author's uncle, Besarion Nižaradze, had finished his Georgian Swan Russian lexicon, which was printed as late as 2007. Both these dictionaries concern the Upper Bar dialect of Swan, as does the Swan English Dictionary by Chato Buceciani and Letas Palmaitis, published in 1985. In contrast to this, the Lashk dialect is represented in the Swan Georgian Russian Dictionary by Karpets Dondua, which was compiled in the 1930s but appeared only in 2001. The Swan Georgian Dictionary by Aslan Ibart Eludi of 1994 relates to the patois of Choluri. The big Swan Georgian Dictionary by Varan Topuria and Maxime Kaldani, published in 2000, was the first attempt to provide a cross-dialect dictionary of the Swan language. And the first morpheme dictionary of Upper Swan is currently in the press. For Lars, the first word list with French translations was published by Hradja Acharyan in his Études sur la langue Laz of 1897, followed by the Lars Russian Slovak in Nikolai Mar's grammar of 1910. Since the late 1990s, an ever-increasing number of Lars Turkish dictionaries have appeared in Turkey, and 2 Lars Georgian ones were published in 2012 by Irina Asatyani and 2013 by Adi Tandilava. Let me now outline the development of Kotvelian lexicography using the example of Georgian, with special emphasis on the principles of the lemmatization of nouns and verbs that have been applied throughout history. Reference to the sister languages of Georgian will only be made sporadically. Given the close structural similarity of the 4 languages, most of the observations that are true for Georgian are also true for the other members of the family. As mentioned above, the first dictionary of Georgian ever published was the Georgian-Italian Dizionario, compiled by Stefano Paolini, the director of the printing house of the Sacra Congregazione di Propaganda Fide in Rome, for the use of Catholic missionaries. The Georgian who assisted Paolini was the nobleman Nikifore, or later Nikolaos Irubakidze Cholokashvili, who was educated in Italy at the beginning of the 17th century before becoming the court priest of King Teimuraz, the first of Kakhetia in East Georgia. After fleeing to Jerusalem during the attacks of the Persian Shah Abbas I, he sojourned in Italy again between 1626 and 29 as a messenger of King Teimuraz to Pope Urban VIII, and it was during this sojourn that he must have met Paolini. From 1632 on, he was the counselor of King Levan II Dadiani of Mingrelia, and after another sojourn in Jerusalem, he became the Catholicos of Mingrelia and Abkhazia by order of Levan in 1656 or 7. Captured by Vamek III, the ruler of Odisha, in 1657, he died in prison in 1658, remaining acknowledged as a wise man and philosopher by his contemporaries. An Italian Theatine missionary named Teramo Cristoforo de Castelli, who visited Georgia from 1632 to 1654, drew this sketch of Irubakidze, which has survived in his travel notes. Looking at the first pages of the Diccionario, which was the first book printed with Georgian Mkhedruli characters ever, it becomes clear at once that it was compiled with no linguistically based lexicographical method and with no sufficient knowledge of Georgian. Of the 45 entries contained on pages 3 to 4, 12 consist of more than one word without indication of a word boundary, as in the case of Abaroga Make, obviously representing Georgian Abaraga, look, come on. Avadari Amalarsi, representing Avad Ari, he, she is ill. Avikatsi Inhumano, reflecting Avikatsi, evil man. Or Aklamovides, adesso è venuto, equaling Aklamovides, now they have come, with a pluralic verb substituted by a singular form. Not only Avad Ari, he is ill, is wrongly translated by an infinitive, Amalarsi, but also other finite forms, like the first person future, Aval, I will go up, by Ascendere, or the second person imperative, Aire, take up, by Alzare. And Adi, which can only mean Georgian Adi, go up, is even rendered by the preposition di. In some cases, the form simply remains unclear. This is true, for example, for avanduno, mormorare, which must conceal something like the first person singular future form, davudunev al murmur, or amorzenebeli biastemare, which possibly reflects the present participle amzenebeli in the sense of stimulating. The two entries, avadaf pamo, maltrattare, and avadaf pare, maltrattato, are likely to contain avad, badly again, but can avad daf paro, I will hide badly, and avad daf pare, I hid badly, be meant here? Aglia, tristezza, compassione, must represent aglia, he, she, it is missing, if anything. And the case of avania, calumny, defamation, remains unclear, even if it might be derived from avi, bad, again. In the nominal domain too, there are some questionable entries. Amosarletica may still be translated as an adjective orientale, although it's the genitive singular of Amosarleti, east. However, Tzotwils, that is, Tzotwils, is by no means restricted to female persons, as the translation Petkatrice suggests. Instead, it is simply the dative singular of Tzotwili, sinful sinner, the participle formation from Tzotba, sin. While Bzola, guerras, clearly stands for Bzola, the form Bzole, battaglia, remains defective, no matter whether it represents the plural Bzolevi or the obsolete verbal noun Bzoleba, joining battle. On the other hand, the verbal noun Kitwa, interrogation, is represented by both Itka and Kitwa, with two different translations, interrogare and domandare. And of the two participles pertaining to it, Itkuli and Kitreli, only the former is discernible with no doubt, because the initial M is left out in the latter. Many of the examples treated so far have already shown that the Latin transliteration applied in the Dictionario is far from being consistent. Apart from mere curiosity, such as the unmotivated prothesis of a p in Tzotbili, sinful, or Tzotwa, sin, and the like, there is systematic confusion, for example, in the case of velars. Written K may stand for the fricative ch as in achla, now, aspirated k as in aklemi, camel, glottalized k as in aklia, is missing, juvelar kol as in avi sitroi, bad word, or voiced g as in gatsmedidi, cleaned. On the other hand, all these five velars can also be represented by the digraph ch, as in abikatsi, bad man, or abazaki, robber, with glottal k, abaki, which is abaak, look here, with aspirated k, Querzki, egg, with a fricative ch, pashamagi, peacock, with voiced g, or skriva, by, with juvelar kol. A similar picture can be seen in the representation of dental parents and affricates. Written z may stand for the voiceless affricate ts, as in abakatsi, bad man, or tsa, heaven, glottalized z, as in tzams, I believe, or tsabli, chestnut, voiced z, as in bzola, battle, or tsarli, dog, but also s, as in savartchali, come, voiced z, as in zamtari, winter, or j, as in jami, time, hour. On the other hand, ts can also be represented by ts, as in katsi man, in contrast to abikatsi, which we've seen before, and also by tz, as in the derivative katsobrigi, human, etc. The z in palamizos, palmare, reflects no Georgian sound at all because the word form is simply the first person singular present of a Greek word. Palamizo is Greek I smear. From all this, we may conclude that the entries of the dictionary were not written down by a Georgian. Instead, they must have been noted in Latin script offhand, applying rules of Italian spelling. This is suggested by the application of ch for velar sounds, especially before high vowels, as in the name of the Georgian co-author Irbakidze, which is written Irbaki with ch on the title page. By the way, this spelling led to erroneous renderings such as Irbachi or Erbachi in Georgian contexts later. To be more precise, we may assume that the Latin word forms were noted down from dictation, which implies typical acoustical errors such as the confusion of f and ch in Safeli nome, which represents Sacheli name. The rendering in Georgian script can only have been added at the end on the basis of correspondence rules given in the alphabet table printed at the beginning of the dictionary. You see it here. And this process appears to have been randomized to a certain degree. It is hardly imaginable that a learned person like Nikolos Nikifore Irbakidze might have accepted the result as being a usable diccionario of Georgian. Whether or not he ever took it into account is even uncertain. What remains worthwhile investigating is the notation of word accents in the Latin transcripts, a phenomenon that cannot be studied in Georgian written sources themselves, as Georgian does not have accent marks at its command. For our present purposes, however, it might suffice to summarize that the diccionario is anything but systematic in the structure of nomadic entries it contains. Nominals mostly appear in nominative forms, but genitives and dative are also met with, and advilid, for example, is by no means a noun meaning facilita, but the adverbial case form advilad of the adjective advili, easy. Verbs are often listed in forms of first-person singular present or future form or second-person imperatives, but other second and third-person forms also occur, as in the cases of ibis dolere, which represents stivis, it hurts him or her, or gzinos somnolenza and gzinebia somnolento, which must stand for gzinas, you sleep, and the evidential perfect form gzinebia, you must have slept. The fact that both these verbs have an indirect construction with the subject in the dative case and an object prefix in the corresponding verb forms is one of the major problems encountered by any lexicographer of Georgian and the other Kartvelian languages, and we will return to it later. The corresponding verbal nouns ibili and zili sleep are also contained in the forms ibili and zili, but the relationship remains obscure to anybody who does not master the Georgian grammar, given that there is no information as to grammar implied. Different from Paulini, Julius von Klaproth in his Vocabulaire Géorgien Français of 1827 provides the Georgian material in Georgian script only, with no Latin transcription and in quite reliable form. This is not astonishing, given that the author was a well-trained linguist who had learned to deal with many Oriental languages, including Chinese, and his Asia Polyglotta of 1823 has remained famous to the present day. Nevertheless, there are certain shortcomings in his vocabulary that can be noted offhand again. First of all, it can easily be proven, even on the first 2 pages, that Klaproth used Paulini's Diccionario as a source. It is true that there is no trace of 2 or multiple word expressions like abaraha, look, come on, or abaak, look here, in it, but many errors and uncertain words are repeated, as in the case of advilid facilita, which should be facilité, which should be advilad easily, or avisari, pest, which can hardly be anything but avidari, bad weather, or avisari, bad bell. In some cases, Klaproth improves on his predecessor, as in the case of abreshumi, soie, silk, which was written with O in the Diccionario, and he even adds etymologies for clear borrowings, as in the case of the latter word, which he equates with Persian abrishun. However, among the many items Klaproth listed for the first time, such as, for example, Abedi, Tinder, Abi, Hill, or Agaraki field, there are again some uncertain or untestified words such as Adeli, name of a measure of 3 feet 4 English inches, which would be 1 meter, and which appears alongside the common term Adli, equaling the Russian arshin, or the English yard, that is 71.12 centimeters. More alarming are new errors such as Absiki, robber thief, which should be Awasaki. Here, Paulini's Awasaki is even more correct. Verbs are mostly cited in the first-person singular present form, as in the case of Avdiva, I am mounting, appearing instead of Paulini's first-person future Aval, I will mount. Other subject persons are avoided, for example, by using the participial formation Ava Opi, being ill, instead of Paulini's third-person form Avadari, it is ill. Besides finite first-person singular forms, Klaproth amply registers verbal nouns, often in the adverbial case, which may well be used to render final infinitives, as in the case of Adgomat se lever, in order to stand up. But however, there is no concept discernible as to his preferences. The first dictionary from Georgia proper that has survived is the Carpoli Lexicon by Sultan Saba Orbeliani, a nobleman who was born in southeast Georgia in 1658. Orbeliani, who was educated at the royal court before becoming a monk in the monastery of David Garija and traveling to Europe as a missioner for King Vakhtang VI, also authored the first Georgian translation of the Indian Panchatantra under the title Kililada Damana, translated from a Persian model, and the famous Book of Wisdom and Lies, a collection of fables and tales from various Oriental sources. The work on his dictionary, which he styled as Sitwis-Ona, that is a bunch of words, extended from 1685 to 1716, and has manifested itself in a total of 6 handwritten reductions. Here, by the way, you see not only his portrait, but also the entrance to his prayer house, which is situated some 70 kilometers southeast of Tbilisi. From the author's testament added to the lexicon, it is clear that his work was meant to substitute a former Sitwis-Ona compiled by King Vakhtang V, which has been lost in his days. We also learn that Orbeliani took a smallish Armenian dictionary as the model, and that he gained his material from the Bible and other theological writings, as well as philosophical texts. As to his method, he explains how he dealt with words whose meaning was not clear to him, and he states that he expected others to continue and complete his work, also by adding material from foreign languages like Greek, Latin, Armenian, Russian, and Arabic, which he himself did not master. What Saba does not tell us is the way how he organized his dictionary linguistically with respect to its lemmatic entries. This, however, becomes quite clear if we look at some of the words beginning with the letter Hi on the last 2 pages of the edition of 1844. Here we find, first of all, nouns like peruli, smooth, correctly cited from Psalm 134, with the appropriate definition Tsireram Zili, that means a somewhat short sleep. For Roartagi, cited from 3 Kings, Saba gives no explanation, but simply refers to the script in a redaction D of his work, which was not consulted for the edition in 1844, but is available via that of 1966. Then he explains that the word means a letter by kings, totally unalterable, which is quite correct again. The best translation for the Iranian loanword is missive. For horoli, Saba refers to another word he regards as a synonym, namely mo'aba, which, as an Arabic word, denotes a sedan chair. In the academic edition of 1966, Lemma is given as horli, with the same reference to mo'aba or its variant mu'aba, plus a textual reference to Iosipos, which means the Georgian version of the Antiquitatis Judaicae by Flavius Josephus. Lemma horoli is also contained, but only as a variant of oroli, which in its turn is correctly taken to mean a lance or spear. As a matter of fact, there are no 2 different words here, the horoli taken from Flavius Josephus representing the irregularly syncopated stem of Horoli in the instrumental plural form Horlebita, which appears in Book 11, Chapter 12 of the Antiquitates. And this does not denote its sedan share, but just the sword of lance, as the equivalent of Greek Seromastes. Another faulty lemma is Saba's Roni, misprinted as Honi in the edition of 1844, which is listed with reference to the life of George the Hagiourite from the 11th century, with no definition given. What we do find in paragraph 74 of Vivita is the personal name Aaron in the nominative singular form spelled Roni in 5 of the 11 manuscripts available. A similar case is likely to be hidden behind the lemma Hereumisi, which Saba glosses Simiatan Tserali, that is semiography or shorthand writer, with no textual reference. This too may represent a biblical name, namely that of a certain Raum or Reum mentioned in the book of Ezra, Zorobabel, who pertained to the entourage of the Persian king Artaxerxes. In the so-called Mtskheta Bible, which was redacted by Sultan Saba Orbeliani himself, the name appears in the genitive singular form Ariumis, that might have been mistaken for a nominal stem. The last nominal entry, Rokonomosi, which denotes a sort of artisan or official, according to Saba, remains obscure. It is clear that it must represent a Greek term like oikonomos, housekeeper, manager, administrator, or paroikonomos, subordinate administrator, but the word initial deformation would be hard to motivate in both cases. All remaining entries of our sample are verbs. Among them, there is but one verbal noun, namely hooba, which Saba paraphrases as eiskma, that means saying yes. The other 8 lemmas represent finite forms, mostly pertaining to the present tense with the third-person singular subject and with the initial h representing a third-person object marker, as Helamis, Ishi, wishes to do, attested in the 12th century Islamiani Romance, Amatz, Ishi, it exceeds, attested in 1 Corinthians, or Naktas, Ishi chisels out. For this I can deduce only the preverbal da naktas, which translated Greek metas ematizo, in a work of the Neoplatonian Ammonios Armeiou. Besides this, imperfect forms like Lamoda, Ishi wished to do, or Lotsvida, Ishi prayed, are also found, as well as aorist forms like Natra, Ishi intended, and Requa, Ishi told him or her. Different from that, the Bo you will find is a second-person optative form, with ha being the subject person marker. On the other hand, imperative forms abound at the beginning of the dictionary, here illustrated by the first pages of the academic edition of 1966. Among the words with initial a, we find, for example, a be tie up, a bnie shed it upon, a brune send it back up. But 2 second-person singular future forms, namely ad vila you'll simplify and a that you'll make it vicious, are also included. Thus we can see that there is no real system behind Saba's choice of entries, the mere occurrence of a given form being decisive for him. Summing up, we may state that Sultan Saba Orbiani's lexicon is an enormous treasure of rare words, including both obsolete and foreign terms, but also some ghost words that are due to misunderstandings of biblical and other passages. At the same time, the lexicon stands out for the many textual attestation it documents. Concerning verbal forms, however, there is no linguistically based system discernible, finite forms of all types occurring side by side. Even though Sultan Saba Orbeliani spent his last years in Moscow, no attempt of his to correlate his lexicographical work with the Russian language has survived. As a matter of fact, it took more than half a century after his death for the first Russian Georgian word list to be compiled and published in form of a lexicon added as the 6th part to the Georgian Samouchitil by Godarzi Firalov, Piralishvili, who worked as a writer at the court of King Erekle II before he moved to St. Petersburg in 1801. Among the 2,500 entries of this word list, and my thanks are due to Ruslan Asatiani of the National Parliament Library and Irakli Rarivashvili of the National Scientific Library, who made this work accessible to me, there are astonishingly few verbs. For example, of the 62 entries of words beginning with Russian P, on page 161, only 10 are verbal, even though normally Russian dictionaries abound in verbs under P. All cited in the first person singular present and translated into the corresponding Georgian form. Pieshu, v Tamashov, I play dance, Falzu, v Tsotsav, I crawl, Balashchu, Gamovrets, I rinse out, and so on. It is clear from the sample that the list was not meant to represent a basic vocabulary, given that common verbs like padnimat, padnat, lift up, raise, or palucha, paluchit, receive, obtain, are missing, let alone perfectives like palajit, play, or putan. At the same time, we may note, sorry, it's the last ones here. At the same time, we may note that some of the Georgian equivalents are dialectal. For example, prinam, I fly, instead of prinav, while others represent the language of the time. For example, gamovrets, I rinse out, instead of present-day gamovretschav. An investigation into the background of Piratishvili's word list would indeed be really worthwhile. By the time when Piratov Samuchitl was published, another learned Georgian, Nicholas Chubinashvili, was working on the first comprehensive Georgian-Russian dictionary, which he completed in 1825. But it took until the year 1961 for this work to be printed. 10 years later, Alexander Gonti also published the second opus magnum of the same author, the complete Russian-Georgian dictionary, compiled by Chupinov between 1825 and 1837. Looking at the latter work, we will notice immediately that the author's claim to be complete was not exaggerated. The 13 entries comprised on column 1 of page 211 of volume 2 match near to exactly the number of entries we find between padnimat, to lift up, and padovye, similarly in the big dictionary of the Russian Academy, published in 6 volumes in St. Petersburg between 1806 and 1822, which can therefore be regarded as Chubinashvili's primary source. Nevertheless, there is a major difference between the monolingual Russian Slavar and its adaptation by the Georgian scholar. While the former work, as you see, I hope you can read it a bit, while the former work usually lists verbs in the form of both imperfective and perfective infinitives, the only exception in the given sample being the impersonal verb padabayet, it fits, registered in the third person singular present, Chubinashvili presents his verb in first person singular present or future forms throughout, with the same exception. It is likely that this practice, which we already noted for Klaproth's vocabulaire and Firarov's lexicon, was due to an influence of the lexicography of the classical languages Greek and Latin, where the first person singular has always been the traditional lemma form used. It should be added that the first person singular forms are contained in the academic dictionary too, as a grammatical information given together with other forms under the infinitives. In Chubinashvili's lexicon, we find the corresponding forms, including the infinitives, under the first person lemmas. There is one more thing that throws an interesting light on the relationship between Chubinashvili's lexicon and the Russian Slovak, namely the textual attestation mentioned for many words, which are often identical, as in the case of James 2:3 and Psalm 109:1, noted for Padnorje, Quarzelbeki, footstool in these two lexicons. In some cases, Chubinashvili adds further attestations, such as Psalm 98:5, that use under the same word. Interestingly enough, only the latter verse does contain the word Quarzelberg as an equivalent of Greek Bobodion. In James 2:3 and Psalm 109:1, the same Greek word is rendered by Quesheperchta, under the feet, in the Georgian Bible instead. In contrast to this, the Russian Church Slavonic Bible does have Padnorje in both these verses, so that we may suspect that Chubinashvili did not even check the Georgian Bible when he imported the citations. A big step forward in the lexicography of Georgian was achieved by a nephew of Nikol Chubinashvili, David, who spent most of his life in St. Petersburg. His Georgian-Russian-French dictionary of 1840 was not only the first three-language dictionary of Georgian, but also the first that was published with an explicit description of the lexicographical method applied in it. It was not the author himself, however, who provided that description, but the French scholar Marie-Félicité Brosset, a true pioneer of Georgian studies who worked in Russia as a member of the Russian Academy of Sciences from 1838 to 1880. In his preface to Chubinashvili's dictionary, he wrote, and I translate into English, "This is the path the author felt obliged to follow. Given that it is indispensable to know the verbal noun which substitutes the infinitive in Georgian in order to understand the verb, and given that the verbal noun is nearly always best suited to demonstrate the root elements, he took the verbal nouns as the basis for his arrangement, ordered alphabetically and as the head entry of all verbal forms deriving from them. Concerning other nouns and adjectives, be they primary or derived from verbal nouns, he listed them in alphabetic order. In this way, the dictionary exhibits both the arrangement by roots in the case of verbs and that by derivatives for the rest. This method has the advantage that it involves less danger of omitting individual verbs that would otherwise have to be listed all under one letter, namely v, which is the prefix of the first person indicative. Having experienced the usefulness of the precognition of the root elements in Georgian myself, I realized that this method will also be useful for others, and even though it may temporarily be regarded as being less convenient than the arrangement preferred elsewhere, I encouraged the author to choose this procedure. The actual method applied by Chubinashvili can easily be demonstrated by looking at the lemmas appearing on page 31. Here we find, first of all, the verbal noun adgoma, standing up, classified as a nom d'action, action noun, and accompanied by the first person singular future form of the intransitive verb avsgebi, I'll stand up, which is styled the neutral verb neutre, and translated by the Russian and French infinitives stavat and selever. As a separate lemma, we then see adgoma listed a second time as a non-substantive, denoting the resurrection. Next, we have the verbal noun asdubneba, with two finite forms pertaining to it, namely the intransitive asdubnebi, I'll boil up, and its transitive counterpart, I'll bring to the boil. The following lemma is a verbal noun again, namely areba, taking, in its turn provided with two different transitive formations, namely the subjective arvireb, I'll take except for myself, and the neutral arvareb, I'll open. Areba 2 is listed the second time as a substantive denoting the last day before Lent. And the verbal noun is also contained in aremitsema, commerce, literally taking and giving, and its participle derivative aremitsemi, merchant, take, giver. The subsequent verbal noun is arelbeba, as well furnished with two different finite forms, the transitive arelbeb, undulate, agitate, and the intransitive passive styled the verb réfléchi, arelbebis, I'll become agitated. The next to last entry, aviareba, classified as a substantive confession, could have been treated as a verbal noun too, given that finite forms such as aviareb, I'll confess, to exist. In contrast to this, the last lemma, and only the last lemma on the page, aviredi, is a pure nominal formation, with its meaning being given as golden bridle. Thus, the plan outlined by Brosset was accomplished. The basic form is the verbal noun, and the remarkable innovation is that different diatheses, active, passive, reflexive, neutral, are included in a more or less systematic way, partially including the so-called versions, subjective, objective, and neutral. Not so innovative is Chubinashvili's Georgian-Russian-French dictionary with respect to citations, which are mostly taken from the Bible, as in Sultan Saba Ordelianis lexicon. They are not necessarily the same, however, and sometimes hard to verify. A clear dependency from the latter works manifests itself in many rare and obsolete lemmas registered in Chubinashvili's dictionary, including errors and ghost words. One such case is the word aviredi, which we've just had. With both its classification as a noun and its translation as golden bridle, David Chubinashvili, as well as his uncle Nico before him, obviously relies upon Saba's lemma aviredi, which is given with the same meaning, okros lagan. What the Chubinashvilis do not quote is the reference to the third book of Ezra's, which we find in Saba's lexicon. Here, however, we see that aviredi is not an independent word, but the second part of an exocentric compound okro aviredi, which means equipped with a bridle of gold. with gold being represented by okro and arvireti being adjectival derivative of arviri, bridle. Such shortcomings notwithstanding, it was clearly David Chubinashvili with the three big dictionaries, Georgian, Russian, French, Russian, Georgian, and Georgian, Russian, who paved the way for the lexicographical work on Georgian in the 20th century, especially with the use of verbal nouns, also called masters, as grammatic entries as proposed by Broussais. This principle is clearly visible, for example, in Richard Mecklein's Georgian-German and German-Georgian dictionaries of the 1920s and 30s. Here you see the title page of the former. On its page 23 to 24, we find the same 5 verbal lemmas from Ardgoma to Arviareba we have just seen in Chubinashvili's work, all given as verbal nouns, with but one minor difference consisting in the replacements of Arduneba by the younger variant Arduveba. Different from Chubinashvili, however, Mecklein provides neither textual references nor finite verbal forms. Instead, we find past participles such as Ardgomili auferstanden or Arebuli genommen, and also a nominal derivative Ardegi denoting the last Sunday before the event, Toten Sonntag. Mecklein's dependence from Chubinashvili and lastly Sultan-Sava-Orbeliani becomes nevertheless apparent by the inclusion of faulty lemmas like Arviredi Zaum mit goldenem Mundstück. The verbal noun is also the basic lemmatic form for verbs in the big explanatory dictionary which was initiated by Arnold Chikababa and which appeared in 8 volumes between 1950 and 64. See here the title page and page 745 to 750 of the first volume. However, the explanatory dictionary abounds in lemmata that are headed by finite forms. In this case, the third person singular forms of either the present or the future tense, here indicated by red color into quotes. For example, Aretz is the third person singular present form meaning I open, and the fact that perfective forms of this verb take the preverb ga is indicated by the third person aorist and perfect forms ga'aro and ga'uria subsumed under the lemma with the preverb given in half brackets. The future form ga'aretz is registered as well under the letter g, but as a separate lemma with the same aorist and perfect forms added. In this way, there is hardly any danger for a given verbal formation to be omitted, including all combinations with preverb and all diatheses and versions. This is all the more true since participles like Ardgomili, resurrected, or Arebuli taken are also listed here in blue color. If we consider that the lemmas are plentifully illustrated with textual examples from Georgian literature beginning with 19th century authors like Ilya Chavchavadze, and if we take into account that dialectal terms are also comprised to a certain degree, the Gamardeviti lexicon is, with no doubt, the most comprehensive dictionary of modern Georgian that we possess. At the same time, it must be stated that it does not contain obsolete or rare words from the modern past, so that it cannot be used for medieval or even older texts. The basic principles of the Gamardeviti lexicon are also followed in the comprehensive Georgian English dictionary that was published under the guidance of Donald Brayfield in 2 volumes in 2006. This is the title page of volume 1, and here you see pages 122 to 3. In this dictionary too, the mustard is the main lemmatic entry form for verbs, here listed in green, and third person singular present or future forms in red, as well as participles in blue, are also registered systematically. The Georgian English dictionary thus opens the huge lexicographical treasury of Arnold Chikobaba's work for non-native speakers of Georgian. At the same time, there is a major difference in that Brayfield and his co-authors try to cover the Georgian language diachronically, including lots of obsolete words from Middle and Old Georgian times, the latter mostly taken from Ilya Abulatse's materials of an Old Georgian dictionary and its continuation by Zurab Sarveladze. Even though it is not stated explicitly, Sultan-Sava-Orbeliani's lexicon also left its traces in it, including some dubious or erroneous words. This is true, for example, for the obscure sedan chair, Horli, and its variant Horeli, which obviously arrived here via Chubinashvili's dictionaries. On the other hand, Arviredi is not perpetuated as such, but only in the compound Okros Arviredi, which is a younger variant of Okro Arviredi, which we saw before. Be that as it may, the Georgian English Dictionary is well suited to illustrate the complexities of the Georgian verbal system in toto. As in the Gamma-Gravity lexicon, perfectivizing and prewords are indicated by the addition of aorist and perfect forms below the third-person singular present lemma form. This is the case, for example, with areps, opens, for which Raphael provides gaaro and gauria, just as Chikobaba did, only without half brackets. In a case like arebinets, the causative of areps, a total of 6 preverb combinations are given altogether with their different meanings, namely ga-arebina, has something open, etc. At the same time, the forms display the systematical interchange of version vowels within paradigms and beyond. We may note, for example, the perfect form gauria with objective version vowel u versus neutral a in the present aret and the aorist ga-aro, or the relative version vowel e in the passive future and aorist form aref-seba and aref-so will be or was filled for somebody, which disappears in the perfect form ar-sevia. For the causative arebinet, the underlying basic verb is indicated by aireps with the subjective version vowel e, etc. And of course, irregularities and subliterism in the formation of verbal paradigms had to be accounted for too. For example, the third-person future form ava as the lemmatic entry he will go up is provided together with the first and second-person forms aval and achval, as well as the third-person plural form avlen, but also the 3 singular persons of the aorist avedi, achvedi, and avida, and the third-person perfect asula. Except for avlen, all these forms are also indicated in the explanatory dictionary, which additionally lists the first and second-person perfect forms asulbar and asulchar. The lemma ava is referred to from its more regular biform avals, but not from adis, which is third-person present form, he goes up. As the corresponding aorist and perfect form show, avida, achvedi, asula, this is actually the suppletive present tense of ava, so that there is a notable lack of cross-reference here, again in agreement with the explanatory dictionary. The intention to avoid inconsistencies like these may have been the reason for Gita Schwenk-Eli, a Georgian from Kutaisi who came to study in Germany in 1920 and spent most of his life in Hamburg and Zurich, to choose a totally different way of representing Georgian verbs. In his 3-volume Georgisch-Deutsches Wörterbuch, which appeared in fascicles between 1965 and 1974, you see here the title page of the first volume and page 43 to 4. This author does provide verbal nouns, styled infinitives like areba, Einnahme, Erhebung, or arelbeba, Wogen, Brandung, Erregung, as well as participles such as arelbebuli, bewegt, erregt, as lemmatic entries, but by far not consistently and in a much less exhaustive way than the explanatory dictionary does. The major difference from the latter consists in the fact that Schwenk-Eli does not register finite forms or verbs as lemmas. Instead, his basic entry form is the abstract verbal root, on which all subparadigms of transitive, medial, passive, indirect, and causative formations are subsumed, all indicated primarily by first-person singular present and future forms, together with the corresponding aorist and perfect forms, and thus including all preverb combinations and versions, plus the relevant verbal nouns, style infinitives. This results in an extremely complex structure of entries, which sometimes extend over many pages, as in the case of the root r, underlying the verb noted as arets in Chikobaba's and Raphael's dictionaries. First of all, this root is divided into 2, r1 and r2, with the 2 distinct basic meanings of open and take. Under r1, we first find a transitive verb in neutral version vareb, which in combination with the prefix amo, gar, gamo, da, she, and shemo, in its perfective forms carries meanings like aufklappen, öffnen, offenbaren, aufsperren, aufmachen, oder halb aufmachen. Next, Schwenk-Eli lists the transitive verb in objective version, vureb, again with 4 preverb combinations and meanings such as open something for somebody. Under the same root, we further find the causative varebinet with 5 preverb combinations and the passive in relative version ereba, which only combines with ga. Under r2, the first formation listed is the transitive verb in subjective version vireb with a total of 12 preverb combinations and meanings like aufnehmen, auf sich nehmen, then another objective verb with 11 preverbs. The transitive verb in superpassive version, vare, and another positive, varebine. We further have the passive with pre-radical e, and the relative passive ereba, and the relative passive of the, the relative passive verebine become the object of gossip, and the indirect verb marebineps, denoting something like something makes me vomit. I hope this is not the case with you now. In the case of suppletivism, Schrankelli's solution consists in subsuming the root variants suppleting each other in a given set of verbal paradigms under one main root entry. In the maximal case of the verb meaning go, this results in a total of 9 roots being joined with slip as the main entry, namely di, val, va, vl, ved, vel, vid, s, and ar. This permits to bring together under one heading present formation subjects abdi, var, I go up, in the future aval, ours, abedi, absu, var, pluperfect, absuli, kavi, and other corresponding forms of other persons such as third person, artis, or apida. There can be no doubt that Schrankelli's approach is linguistically well-founded, and the detailed explanation of his method outlined in the introduction to the first volume of his Wörterbuch is certainly one of the most thorough analyses of the Georgian verbal morphology ever published. Nevertheless, it must be stated that Schrankelli was by no means the inventor of the root-based analysis of the Kartvelian verbal system. As a matter of fact, a similar method was applied in the early dictionaries of both Lars and Megrelian, which appeared as appendices to the grammars by Nikolai Mark and Josef Lipschitze, and it was certainly the former author who was responsible for this innovative solution. Looking back to Marie-Félicité Bourset's introduction to the Georgian-Russian-French dictionary by Chubinashvili of 1840, we might suppose that the innovation was envisaged even some 70 years earlier, given that Bourset explicitly talks about roots and radicals. However, Bourset did not go so far as to suggest to take the root proper as the thematic entry form, as we've seen above. And even though it is likely that Marx did study Bourset's work thoroughly, we may rather suspect that his preference for root-based entries derived from his preoccupation with Semitic languages such as Arabic or Hebrew, the lexicography of which was traditionally being based on verbal roots. Whether or not Itat Schrankelli met Mark in his youth in Georgia or in Moscow is unknown, and it is not very probable that he did, as his first object of study was law, not linguistics or philology. Yet he may have well become acquainted with Marian ideas in the first 25 years of his life, between 1895 and 1920, so that the assumption that his approach was largely based upon Mars is anything but far-fetched. Here you see a sample from Mars' last dictionary. The question remains which approach is better suited for the lexicographical representation of Georgian and correspondingly the other Kartvelian languages. In my view, this depends a lot on the envisaged target group of users. Native speakers, who may look for definitions of meanings rather than grammatical information, will certainly prefer an approach which is less analytical, given that they will easily be able to derive verbal nouns from given finite forms. And they will not need much additional information as to the latter, maybe except for questions of normativity. In contrast to this, non-native speakers, especially learners, may have difficulties in deriving verbal nouns, while the extraction of an abstract root from a given finite form may be a simpler task. So they may prefer a root-based approach like the one applied by Itat Schrankelli. For linguists, too, the approach of analyzing morphological structures in a given verbal form with a view to determine a root may be more adequate, while for non-linguists they remain awkward. Thus, there is no clear preponderance for the one or the other approach, and we can simply be happy that we have access to the rich lexicon of Georgian in so different ways. Outlook. In the 21st century, lexicology is undergoing notable changes due to the necessity of applying it in digital environments. With the emergence of big text corpora, the need to structure the data has made lemmatization a primary task beyond lexicography proper, and this is also true for Georgian. The project of Georgian National Corpus, which is meant to cover the whole diachrony of written Georgian up to the present day, this task has been envisaged right from the beginning, and the approach chosen is, so to say, a twofold one. Given that one of the main functions of the corpus is to provide search functions, it is clear that a form like achval, the second person singular future meaning you will go up, must be retrievable as such, which is easy to implement. Within the 200 million word forms contained in the Georgian National Corpus, a search for the form yields a total of 93 attestations from the 12th century on. However, for more sophisticated analyses, for example on the syntax of a given verb, it will be indispensable to be able to search for all the different tense, mood, aspect and personal forms appearing in a given verbal paradigm altogether without having to enter all of them separately. In the GNC, this is provided by the verbal nouns, in the given case asla, which are linked as searchable lemmatic entries to every single finite form. At the same time, the morphological analysis is also provided, thus facilitating a search for the use of, for example, second-person singular forms independent of the verb they pertain to. Beyond that, the root analysis is also provided, thus admitting to search across the paradigms of all the individual verbal formations sharing this root, which in the given case is sl or bl. In this way, distinct forms like achval and its perfect tense equivalent asulchar are linked together via the same verbal noun, asla, the same head root, sl, and the same preverb, are all searchable in their own right, and the search for asla as their simple common lemma yields a total of 13,040 attestations comprising forms so different as the third-person singular aris abida, the third-person plural imperfect adioden, the second-person singular imperative adi, or the first-person singular future aval. Searching for the root-based lemma sl, we even received 871,000 hits, a figure that gives an idea of the diversity of formations sharing this root. It is clear that the implementation of the underlying grammatical knowledge base cannot yet be 100% reliable, all the more since spelling errors in the corpus still exist. However, the GNC can and will be improved continuously, and the increasing number of linguistic investigations that are based upon it shows that the attempt to combine both the verbal noun and the root approach is well founded. Thank you very much indeed.